What's up guys, it's Multiplier and today we are looking at a really cool plugin. It is called Audio Helix. Now it's a synth and it is really complicated and a bit weird, but it's super fucking cool. It does some really cool stuff. It gives you a lot more control than your average kind of plugin. In fact, it gives you way more control than the average plugin. Gives you some really unique, some really kind of interesting control as well. It doesn't just give you the normal buttons. And what I'm hopefully going to do today is give you enough of an introduction to it so that when you then start kind of opening it up yourself and having a play around, you're not completely lost. Because I tell you what, this is not the simplest thing in the world and it gets quite technical and some of the things are a bit weird about it. But once you kind of push through that and you really start to understand how it works, you can do some really insane stuff with it. And yeah, let's get straight into it. So Helix. What is it? What is it about? Well, I've no idea technically what kind of synthesis it is, but it's kind of like wavetable synthesis, but just a little bit sort of different. And yeah, I'll kind of show you kind of broadly speaking how it all works. So how it works, well, you fundamentally got a few different sections. Now, the first section I will look at is the presets, simply because even the presets isn't necessarily trivial. So you have kind of three sections to look at when it comes to presets. You have the bank, which is almost like your upper level folder. So it's almost like a tiered folder structure. So if you kind of look at where the mouse is now, we have this section. So this is where what's called a bank is, a bank of presets. So if we choose, say, I don't know, this one, Forbidden Fields, then we have a subcategory, almost like a subfolder. So at the moment it's on ambience. So we could choose anything from ambience, bass, FM, whatever. So each of these preset banks has its own set of categories, almost like subfolders. And then from within those subfolders, there should be a bunch of presets, except I happen to choose the only one with no presets. Right, so we've chosen our bank, we've chosen our category, and now we get a whole bunch of presets. So when I first opened up Helix, I didn't realize that everything kind of came in this weird structure, so I got a bit confused as to why there weren't many presets. So it's just worth knowing it happens in this kind of tiered subfolder structure. Cool stuff. Now, I've no idea how to load up a default preset in this synth. I've no idea. I've looked in the manual and I can't figure out what the button is and I can't see a button. So for all I know, there's no way of loading up a basic default preset. However, it won't stop us looking at this whole thing right about now. So I'd say the first thing to kind of be aware of is fundamentally we have 4 oscillators. So we have in the top left section, we have where all these oscillators are. So at the moment we're on the oscillator 1 and 2 tab, as you can see over here. So we have 2 oscillators in 2 sections, oscillator 1, oscillator 2, nice and simple. And then oscillators 3, oscillators 4, which all behave as you'd expect. You also get a whole bunch of kind of filters and kind of distortion bits. So filters tend to take away frequencies, distortion, or otherwise known as shaping or saturation, call it whatever you like. That kind of adds in frequency. So you get 6 different stages. You can use as few or as many as you like. You can route them in loads of cool ways. Each one has loads of controls, but fundamentally that's what's going on down here in the stages section. And you can also route any of these oscillators into any of these stages. So you can see how already you've got this really insane potential happening because you can route things in really cool ways. So you have these general stages of filters and distortion bits and then shaping. You also get a whole bunch of effects down here in the effects section. That's reasonably simple. You can change the order of the effects. You can do some cool stuff. That's reasonably obvious. If you glance your eyes to the top right, we have EG. No idea what EG stands for. Probably envelopes something, because it's basically this is where all the envelopes are. So you get 8 envelopes and you kind of choose between them by clicking 1, 4 or 5, 8. So you see how we now got 1 to 4, EG1, EG2, EG3, EG4, and so on with 5 to 8. Nice stuff. Now, the really important thing to know with this that really isn't obvious unless you read the manual, you pretty much have to just know it or figure it out by trial and error. EG1, i.e. the first envelope, is mapped to the amplitude of each voice or the amplitude of each oscillator. So EG1 is pretty much like your main envelope for the main sound that you kind of start off with. So it's really fundamental, otherwise you're going to get way confused. Now you can always map envelopes to the gain of any particular oscillator to kind of do it in your own weird and wonderful way, but fundamentally each oscillator gets multiplied by this first envelope. So EG1, I'll say it again, is your main envelope for the main sound, as it were. Pretty cool. And we have LFOs in the LFO section over here. Got all sorts of LFOs, like LFOs here. You also got global LFOs. So global LFOs affect the whole thing, whereas these individual LFOs can affect almost anything in the routing section. We have a sequencer section over here where we can do kind of sequence sort of things. It's more of an advanced thing, but again, you have the option to do like sequence-based modulation. And then we have the CC bit where you can map MIDI controllers or whatever else it is that's triggering continuous controller messages into your synth. So pretty cool. The final little section to be aware of is the kind of almost like the general section. So you got the basic keyboard setup, stuff like how whether or not your notes kind of slide between each other if you kind of move from one note to another, whether it slides or just jumps straight there, or how it slides there. All that kind of cool stuff. You get a lot of control over that. You also get control over the polyphony, or whether it's monophony or legato, whatever, as well as a bit of a control over the arpeggio, the ARP bit, and master volume as well. Cool, so they're the basic sections. Now, fundamentally, we've covered the most important bit, which confused me like crazy at first, which is EG1, i.e. your first envelope, is basically controlling the main amplitude of the main sound. Kind of each oscillator gets multiplied by this envelope, which is cool stuff. Now, another few important messages before we get into exactly what goes on with each oscillator is, you see how we've got this big bar in the middle, this big slider? This is basically whatever control you select. So let's say if we choose a setting like, say, this one. Now, because obviously if we want really, really fine control, it can be quite hard to move your mouse as accurately as you want when you're kind of moving a really tiny knob or a really tiny parameter. So whichever knob you've just clicked, this giant fader in the middle gives you fine control over that knob. So if we wanted to control something really, really accurately, because remember there are some controls that are almost like chaos in theory, in the sense that a small change in the input will have a massive change in the output. It can be really nice to have a really fine control over that. You can also enter the value for that particular parameter in this value bit down here I just clicked. So you can see how you can get really, really accurate if you want to. And this becomes especially useful when you start routing various things to like the pitch, say, of something. So you can, if you had, say, a sequencer or an LFO, whatever it is, or an envelope even mapped to the pitch of something, by doing some maths and getting really accurate with the value or the slider, you can get really, really accurate and really tunes. But you can do a lot with it, but fundamentally, big slider gives you fine control over any particular parameter, which is pretty cool. Also, don't get confused. I'll just choose a different patch first, just to give you an example. Pretty much every control here, you control by moving up and down. Now, this gets way confusing, and this is completely whack, but see these horizontal sliders? If you move your mouse horizontally, they won't move. You have to move them up and down. Now, that's completely whack, but you know what? You just get used to it. So don't get confused. I spent ages thinking that the whole thing had broken. You have to remember that these horizontal sliders, just like everything else in this plugin, you vary by dragging up and down. So just kind of remember that and you'll be good. Cool. So that's pretty much the basics of this synth. Now, there's one more section as well. We have the matrix section over here. So just to the right of the oscillators, you have the matrix. This is basically where we do our more advanced routing and where we can kind of map almost anything to almost anything else. So it's really, really cool. You can see how you have all these different matrix kind of routing options. So you can you have like a source, and then you have an amount, and then a destination. So you had a source, say it could be anything from an envelope to an LFO, sequencer, key tracking, whatever else it is, and a destination. So you can map almost anything to anything else. So you get some really complicated routing very, very quickly. And one final kind of general principle that is quite common in this particular plugin, which is quite cool, is that's not standard, is a lot of the faders and a lot of the things are bipolar. So for example, in the case of these envelopes sections, if you have a look at the envelopes, you have all these faders. Now these are bipolar. So that means if you drag it down to the bottom, it's not actually at 0, it's at minus what it would be at the top. So basically you can go up and down with it. So you've got to really just bear in mind and kind of just remember, as you're using various faders and stuff, a lot of these things are bipolar. And that happens a lot when you're shaping your wave as well, because you can end up having like a bipolar effect. So you end up playing something with a negative or like a flipped phase. So just kind of remember that everything or most things happen kind of in a potentially bipolar way when you're playing around with knobs and parameters, and you won't get overly confused. So you can start to see already, if you've kept up, that this is quite an advanced synth, but you can do so much so cool stuff with it once you start to get your head around it. So yeah, fundamentally, how does this thing work? Well, the idea is we have all these oscillators, or 4 oscillators, and then for each oscillator, we are basically kicking out a particular wave, almost like a wavetable will kick out a particular wave. Now that particular wave is shown in this kind of window here, this kind of square guy over here. So this particular wave is what this oscillator is playing. Now how that wave kind of is created is it's a combination of, or kind of a morphing between 2 waves, wave A and wave B. So wave A will be this wave in this little box up here, and wave B will be in this little box over here. And then what basically appears in this bottom box is determined by this really important slider called morph. So you see how, if I should probably give you a better example. Let's choose a preset with 2 quite different wave A and wave B. There you go, this would be a great example. So you see in wave A, we have this kind of like double camel hump dude. And then in wave B, we have this sine wave. So if you have a look at the morphing slider now, see how the morphing slider is right on the left? That means it's basically just doing wave A. But if we pulled the slider to the right, or we can't put it to the right because this whole thing is whack and you need to pull up and down. If we push our mouse up, I pull the slider to the right. See how if you kind of look at the main window, see how it's kind of morphing to the wave B? So I'll do that again. So at the moment it's 2 camel humps, I wave A, and then if we move the slider to the right by dragging it up, yeah, still whack, it annoys me every time. By pulling it up, see how that kind of wave is now morphing into the other one? So that's basically what the morph does. It kind of, you choose a point between 2 different waves. Now the reason why that becomes very cool is naturally you can either automate or you can modulate this morph parameter. So you can modulate that morph parameter with an envelope, with key tracking, with an LFO, fast, slow, whatever else it is. You can kind of fuck with it in loads of cool ways, and that kind of allows you to move between these different waves. So you can kind of see how it's almost like you're creating a wavetable. It's technically not wavetable synthesis, but it's almost like you're creating a wavetable that you can either choose a particular point in said wavetable or modulate it to create some cool morphing sounds. Very cool stuff. And how do you determine what wave A is and what wave B is? Well, that's what goes on in this wave shaping section. So we have this column here. Down here is kind of what determines the shape of wave A. So you've got stuff like the shape, mirror, warp. So you basically just go down, play with the parameters and use a bit of your thinking brain, and you can figure out exactly what each setting does. And then if you're not quite sure what the wave effect it does, just kind of have a play around with it, and you can see as I'm pulling this warp parameter around, for example, how it's affecting the final result. Now, you don't necessarily have to know exactly what, say, warp or mirror is technically doing to the wave. Sometimes it's just nice to know that it's affecting the sound in a particular way, and then by playing with it and experimenting, you can see how that affects the actual sound. So that's fundamentally how it works. You set up your wave with wave A, set up your wave B, and then you can modulate between them. Now, you can also route various kind of modulations, whether it's from any source, like an envelope or LFO, whatever, to these parameters of the individual waves as well. So you can see how in the destination for a particular, what's it gone? Yeah, see how in the destination for a particular thing, we have like oscillator 1, amplitude, pan, harm, morph, pitch, spread wide, whatever. Maybe you can't actually. I thought actually that doesn't make any sense. Yeah, ignore what I just said. You can't modulate these particular things, I don't think. There might be a complicated way of doing it, but maybe not an obvious way. Anyway, ignore that. So yeah, back to where we were. You can modulate a lot of stuff, maybe not quite everything. But yeah, use these 2 columns to set up your waves A and B, which is cool stuff. And yeah, you've also got this really important section called multi. It's basically where you set up your unison style thing where you have multiple voices. And this is where it does some really, really cool stuff that I think a lot more synths should do because it just makes a lot of sense. So you choose your count. This is how many versions of this oscillator it's playing. So you can choose up to 16 per oscillator. Now, the key thing to note here is you can have, whereas normally in a synth that has, say, multiple oscillators that you then have some sort of multiple voicing set up, you've got to have the same, basically it just like multiplies each oscillator. Like you can't have, say, 4 of oscillator 1, 2 of oscillator 2, 1 of oscillator 3. You've just got to have the same number of each. So the cool thing with this is you can determine how many voices come out of each oscillator, which gives you so much potential. So that's really, really cool. So you can choose how many voices come out of this oscillator or how many versions of that oscillator happen. You can spread them in a really cool way. The really, really cool ones here is phase and free. So what these do is they basically stop that phaser effect. So if you've noticed how if you play the same wave kind of multiplied over itself lots of times in a row, kind of over the top of each other, you'll get this weird phaser effect. So if you play with the phase and the free settings, look it up in the manual if you want a technical description as to exactly what they're doing. It will stop that phaser effect. So I've noticed when I was kind of creating a few patches and having to play around, it does an absolutely amazing job of this. So you can create really thick, kind of textured, amazing sounds that just kind of sound really thick and proper without getting any of that weird phasing or having to even spread them too wide. So you can actually get really mono, not really mono, really kind of central sounds that don't have that phaser effect, just because you can basically offset the phase and kind of have that phase move around, but kind of if you consider the difference of each one of those voices from each oscillator. That sounded complicated, but you know what? It makes sense. So yeah, phase and free, really, really cool. Basically stops that phaser effect when you start kind of adding the same oscillator on top of itself. And then if I remember correctly, yeah, so you can also get a visual representation of kind of what's going on sometimes. There you go. So if you glance your eyes over to this kind of like big square over here, which shows you your kind of main wave, you're kind of kicking out. These red lines are kind of like indicators of what's going on with your, with each one of your kind of multiple voices from each oscillator. So see how this count here, if we choose, say, 8, so that means it's kicking out 8 versions of this oscillator. It has 8 of these red arrows, these red lines. And then by adjusting stuff like the phase, you can see how that's now. So when the phase is 0, it's not doing any of this. If I just move this, I move. So it's fine where it is. You see how they're all kind of lined up. So pretty much each one of those waves is starting at the same point in the phase. That's what creates that phaser effect. If we now spread or kind of move this phaser thing up, you see how it's offsetting them all? And that's what stops that phaser effect. And then you can see how by moving this free stuff, it does something else that kind of have a similar sort of effect. And then obviously you got width and then spread, does some other stuff. But you can see how you get visual representation for this. It's really, really nice. And yeah, that's the kind of the multiple voices thing. You could also do some cool stuff with this kind of unstable bit. So this is where you can basically, you know how like when you have an analog synthesizer, the pitch wobbles about a bit, just due to kind of the fact it's analog and it misbehaves a bit. That's what this unstable does. So it's really, really nice way to add a bit of movement and add a bit of, I suppose, realism if used subtly to your preset. So if you use it really subtly, you can create a really nice sort of analog-y sort of effect where the pitch wobbles around a bit and it's just a little bit inconsistent, but it gives it a bit of character, and you can adjust the speed for that. But if you move the amount really high, it just goes completely mental, which is really, really cool stuff. It's definitely worth reading the manual once you've started to get a feel for this particular plugin, just because there's a load of really, really advanced stuff you can do with it. E.g., see how it says mask here for this oscillator? So it basically means we can determine how much of the keyboard triggers that particular oscillator. So it's really, really cool. So you can set up, if you wanted, say, different parts of the keyboard to trigger different oscillators, you can do that just by adjusting these mask sections. And then you've also got key tracking for the key tracking over various sections of the keyboard, so you can determine the effect of the key tracking. It just gives you so much more control than you normally have. Oh, let's close that. For example, I'll give you another quick little thing that's really, really cool. If you have a look at envelope 1 over here, if I move this to here, see how it's like a linear line right now for the attack? If we click this little drop down, we can choose between different types of curviness, which is pretty cool. So you can see how you can basically choose how kind of curvy, and kind of the shape of that particular bit of the envelope. Now, the envelopes here, in terms of what the AD and the S and the R and the R2 do, is non-standard, again, just because this synth is quite idiosyncratic. So the best thing to do is to just play around with the sliders, and you look at the graph and you'll see exactly what slider is doing pretty much what. It's really cool. And you can also, well, I think it's a really nice touch as well, is you can adjust the velocity, the effect that the velocity of you hitting the note has on the attack, the decay, and the level separately. Now, plenty of synths do this in their own little way, but I think it's quite nice to have them in these sliders like there, which is pretty cool. How long has this video been? 20 minutes, right? We're pretty much going to cut it reasonably short, just because believe me, if I went through everything this synth does, it would take like 14 hours. But hopefully, you've got a bit of a feel for how this thing works in terms of conceptually how it works, the layout, some of the weird little quirks about it. But yeah, it's really cool plugin to sum up, and quite complicated, but does an insane amount of stuff once you really start to get a feel for it. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I've been Multiplier. Boom. It's been, I should call this something like an introduction to Helix, because it really isn't an in-depth tutorial, and we didn't even show you any sounds. But it's complicated synth. You gotta think sometimes. You want to do some really cool stuff, and you want to have a lot of control. Sometimes you need to just figure shit out, and that's what hopefully it helped you do. Boom. Enjoy using Helix. It is way cool.